Where does your main character grow up? Where does your story start? How do you even determine where you're going to start your story? Believe it or not, all these questions can oftentimes be the exact same question because a lot of times when it comes to writing a story, figuring out where things are going to go, that's kind of the easy part. Figuring out the awesome action that's going to be happening, that's again really easy. But figuring out where your story starts, that is oftentimes where it's going to be the most difficult. So, hello, my name is Stefan. I'm a fantasy writer, substitute teacher. I do a little bit of everything, teach a little bit of everything, and I love writing fantasy books, and I love actually telling my process behind how I actually go through and write fantasy books. And so starting in with the classic question of where does your main character grow up, it is amazing how often in fantasy stories the story is going to start, with the main character, and it's going to start oftentimes in their particular home. If you think back to a lot of the other famous ones, so like Lord of the Rings, Bilbo Baggins, he's literally at home when Gandalf shows up. Frodo in Lord of the Rings, again, he's at his home, and then the big party happens before he goes off on adventures. If you look at Star Wars, Luke Skywalker is the main character. He starts on his home planet before something happens. Harry Potter, he starts at his home. So, a lot of times when they're talking about characters, they're going to be starting essentially at their home. So this is a very important thing to think about when it comes to figuring out your own story. And how do we figure out even where that's going to be? Well, when you are figuring out your character, you're also going to be thinking about a lot of little details, like what kind of a family do they have? What kind of family dynamic do they have? If you think about stuff like Harry Potter, he was an orphan, but he also had a very terrible home life. Whereas on the flip side, in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, he was also an orphan, but he had a pretty good home life. He had, an aunt and uncle that loved him, as opposed to Harry Potter with a aunt and uncle that hated him. In Lord of the Rings, Bilbo Baggins, he's actually a pretty good father figure to Frodo, and he takes care of him, so Frodo has a really good home life. In The Hobbit, Bilbo lives alone, and so he doesn't really have a family that's around at the time of the start of the story. He did, however, have a very big community that he was part of, and he was a very well-respected individual in that community, and so a lot of people liked him, a lot of people knew him. But then what I love, too, is in The Hobbit, after he's going through and talking about Bilbo Baggins, then Tolkien just goes, but what is a hobbit? And I suppose you could probably explain this. And so he goes into this nice, awesome detail about what a hobbit actually is, and goes into these other details about what Hobbiton looks like and kind of the Shire in general. And so you get this idea of where Bilbo is before you see what happens when Gandalf shows up and just causes him to go off in his wild adventures. In Harry Potter, we're basically introduced to a nice household, and then he's in a cupboard. Luke Skywalker, we've got a big open planet of deserts. So, every story is going to start someplace different. However, then on the other note, then you've got stuff like Wheel of Time. Wheel of Time, the whole thing starts off with the main character, Rand, and he is with his dad, and they are traveling. So they're going to a home area. They're not quite home, but it's in that home community, so still kind of counts in that area. But oftentimes, that's where the story is going to take place. So you've already, at this point, figured out kind of who your character is. You might have figured out sort of what they look like. You might have figured out what their kind of history is, what their background is. Well, with that also now comes the question of what kind of area did they grow up in? Because again, this is pretty much going to be, in general, where your story is going to start. Now, I will also add that when I wrote my book, I started in one location, and I decided that it was going to take place in that spot. And then when I wrote the prequel, I realized that the prequel would actually work better as the first chapter. So even though that spot actually is going to be far away from kind of where everything is, my main character, he starts in his home. So when you're thinking about that, kind of take that into consideration. It's going to be a good way to do it. But now comes the other question with that. How do you figure out what that home actually is? And this is where the personality is going to come into play. This is where the character that you've kind of figured out is going to come into play. The character, they're going to be shaped by history. They're going to be shaped by the landscape. They're going to be shaped by the community that's around them. They're going to be shaped by the, community that's not around them. They're going to have influences. They're going to have friends. They're going to have relatives. They're going to have enemies. They're going to have rivals. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to be around this main character. Even Luke Skywalker, we don't really see a lot of that social stuff in the movies. You really have to look at the books and the expanded universe on that, and even some deleted scenes where he actually went to Tashi Station and you actually saw some of his friends. I wish that they'd include that in the movie, but even then you still get his influences there. So when you're creating your own characters, you're going to think about where they actually exist. And kind of going on that, there are a lot of ways that you can go about this. You can, first off, you can have a character who is more of a city folk. So these kind of people might be like merchants. They might be like any of the craftsmen, somewhere they can stay safe. It might be a royalty. So you might have a prince or a duke or even a king. They might be the main character. They're, of course, going to have their palace, and they're going to have their set area that's going to be where they do their stuff. If you had a farmer, for example, they would probably be maybe close to the city, but they might be on the outskirts somewhere. You've got the wide open fields. You got a nice area that they can be in. Won't necessarily be inside the city walls. They might want to be out and about a little bit more. If you had a character that was in a village, a little small community, they might be out in the fields and out in the wilderness a little bit more. And then coming back in the village kind of is more of a kind of touch and go kind of idea. So if you're thinking about your character, did they grow up in a big city? Did they grow up in a village? Did they grow up in a... they could be nomads. They could be a group of wanderers, and they might go from various places, and they'll still have that community there, not a set location, but they'll just have their group that they travel with. Or maybe your character is a complete absolute loner, and they just wander around. Kind of with that, then, who's going to know your character? Who knows of your character? Is your character someone that has a good reputation? Do they have kind of a weird reputation? Even going on Star Wars once again. Obi-Wan Kenobi, he was regarded as just kind of a crazy old man, old wizard. He was an eccentric character, and people knew of him. They kind of gave him the space that he needed, but they didn't really want to interact otherwise. They acknowledged he did good stuff, but he was still just a little outside of their kind of accepted view of how life can go. So, even in that case, Obi-Wan's story, well, then you have to look back on the prequels to realize how much of his story really is there. So it's possible that even though your main character may start in a location, they've got a whole ton of backstory going on that got them to that location. And maybe that's what the story that you want to write actually ends up being, how they got to where they are. Maybe that's a part of the story that you want to write, how they got to where they are. And, people like to see those kind of things. That's absolutely awesome. But another possible option, what if your character, what if they grew up on the coast as opposed to in the inland area? They grew up on the coast, they're going to have a much better respect of things like ocean and ocean tides and possibly weather conditions. They will probably grow up around a seafood diet. as opposed to if they grow up in the wilderness or in the kind of forest area, they'll have more of a kind of maybe meat, venison, might have more wild game. If they grow up in a kind of urban area, they're going to have more domesticated, so like pigs, cows, chickens, those kind of things. If they grew up in a like an alpine community, then the vegetable situation might be considerably less, but then you've got like mountain goats, lots of other it's kind of mountainous stuff going on there, and all that stuff that's going to shape who they are. That's going to shape where where they get their influences. It's going to shape who they interact with, the kind of things that they like, the kind of food that they enjoy. And when you think about all those little details going on with your main character, that is an absolutely awesome spot to start your story. And part of the reason that's a great spot to start the story is because it's a place that your main character is going to have feelings for. And if your character has feelings for something, and they're able to be conveyed in such a way that we know that they care about or don't care about something, then the reader is going to feel the same kind of stuff. We want to like the things that the main character likes. We want to care about the things the main character cares about. We want to hate the things that the main character hates. We want to feel frustrated with the things that the main character is frustrated with. We want to cheer on our protagonist. We want to, empathize with them. So if your character grows up in an area, then they're going to have feelings about it, whether good or bad, and it's going to cause us as the reader to feel stuff for them. Now, another really cool thing is if a place that starts off as the main character's home, and they love that place like crazy, and then some enemy comes in to want to destroy it, we are really going to hate that enemy. We are really going to want to see that retribution happen. If a character grows up, like in Harry Potter, in a very poor situation, we really want to see them get out of that. We want to see them put that aside and go off and do whatever they want. So by using a spot that your main character is going to be very familiar with and going to have feelings towards, it's going to be a fantastic way to make our audience, ourselves as the readers, actually care about what you're talking about. And when you have a spot like that, if you've got a character that needs to get out of a situation, that is a great way to get the story going. If you have a character that absolutely loves where they are, they're going to need some force to get them out of that. Case in point, Bilbo, he was perfectly content to stay in the Shire. He was content to stay in his home. And then a wizard came along and said, "Yep, you're on an adventure now." Whereas Frodo had much more of an inkling to want to go on an adventure. And the ring kind of helped that out a little bit. So when you're thinking about your original starting spot for your story, think about a place that your main character is going to have feelings towards, because I guarantee you that is going to make the reader have feeling towards it as well. So, best of luck to you. Like I said, I've got a expert book on this, on how to actually create fantasy series. I will leave that link in the comments or the description below. And I've also got my own fantasy book. I will leave the link to that as well. I look forward to seeing you guys again. Until then, take care and happy writing.